Red Team Draft Podcast. I am your host, Alex West, and today I'm joined by Eustaquio Raleigh and Josh Earl. Josh has returned from hiatus, but of course, as is tradition, we can't all be together. So the prodigy himself, Mr. Connor Haar, not with us today. So we're going to carry on in his stead, just like we carried on in Josh's stead last week. So I'll start with you, Josh. How are you today, sir?
I'm doing pretty good after yesterday. I got to meet my third niece. She is delightful and still a little squishy, but she's cool and fairly alert for such a young living creature, but it was really nice.
See, now there you go. Something good in the world. Our executive producer, Mr. Eustaquio Raleigh. Eustaquio, how are you?
I'm doing good. My Cavaliers have won 4 out of 6 after the break and are playing somewhat reasonable basketball now. So that's nice to watch a little bit of during the season.
Is that a good thing?
Well, TBD, but as long as they don't fall too far in the Zion sweepstakes, I'm good with watching somewhat competent basketball a little bit.
Okay. All right. Yeah, because to me, that's a very scary, if you start to slide away from Zion, who knows what the Cavaliers become, but what are you going to do? Anyway, last week we talked about the point guards. Today we're going to move to the opposite end of the spectrum, and we're going to talk about a couple of bigs in this class. We're going to head on Brandon Clarke, Jackson Hayes, Bol Bol, and Jontay Porter. We really like these guys for different reasons. We think they bring some skills to the table, and we're going to talk about the good, the bad, the ugly with all these guys, as well as we're going to do a little bit of fit stuff similar to what we did last week. So let's dive right in and get started. And let's start with probably the hottest name in this group. This is somebody everybody's been talking with. Obviously, the play in the Tennessee game, the block where he just sort of inhaled a guy and just banished him to the shadow realm is the play that everybody sort of thinks of when you think about Brandon Clarke. But Clarke has been pretty spectacular this year as a transfer player. He's averaging 16.6 points, 8.5 rebounds, and then 3.1 blocks a game, most of those on rotations. This is a player that I think a lot of people have sort of latched on to watching him play. Gonzaga getting to play their fair share of nationally televised games with the Maui Invitational, games against Carolina, games against Tennessee. They've been on TV quite a bit, and I think people have latched on to Brandon Clarke as a potential impact player. Now, there is a big question about Clarke. And before I throw it around to you guys, he's 6'8". He probably is shaped a little bit more like a wing than a traditional big guy. Obviously, he's bouncy. He's got a lot of other things going. But that physicality, the thought of a Brandon Clarke having to guard a Joel Embiid or a Steven Adams from night to night is a little bit frightening. So, Josh, let me start with you. Let's talk Brandon Clarke and give me your pros, give me your cons, give me your whole Brandon Clarke take.
Yeah. So I'm a big fan of Brandon Clarke. I'm maybe not drinking the Kool-Aid of him being an instant NBA success, but I really like him as a prospect. On defense, obviously, is kind of his calling card. I think he's a fantastic help defender. He's got excellent timing, great anticipation, good awareness. And I think he's pretty good on ball too. Not as good as he is kind of as a more free safety roaming type team defender. But I think he's got the tools and the skills to kind of be able to switch at least 3 positions defensively, with maybe some spot switching on a couple of the others. The only real con defensively you kind of touched on, he's 6'8", 215 pounds. So the idea of him being a full-time center on the NBA level is kind of tough to wrap your head around. Maybe as a bench small ball 5, but that's still going to limit his minutes and therefore his impact on most NBA teams. Offensively, I think he's a great finisher. He's in like the 97th percentile in the NCAA, according to Synergy, at shots around the basket, not coming from post-ups. And he's in the 99th percentile in runners. So he's got good touch, too, around the rim. My only real negatives on him is he doesn't really set picks. He tends to slip almost all of them, which I mean works for Gonzaga, but it's something that's disconcerting to me for somebody projecting to be a big on the NBA level. And he doesn't really have the handle or consistent enough shot in terms of threat to the defense to actually do much more than be the dunker role on an NBA team. That said, since I'm the shot mechanics guy for us, I do actually think his shot mechanics are pretty good. The only thing is he needs to get some lower hips and a deeper knee bend to generate a little more power in his shots, and that should help with the tendency to shoot a little short. If he can do that, it'll still take time before NBA teams respect his shot, but if he does that to the point where he's an average or above average, just basic shooter from mid-range or corner threes, I think he can get playing time on most NBA teams, but it's kind of a big if at this moment.
But Josh, you touched on something that I think is one of the major issues when you look at a Brandon Clarke is that he has a little bit of a wonky fit when you think about his role on the offensive end and his role on the defensive end. He's not a guy that you're going to want to play alongside of John Collins because he just doesn't have the size to sort of bang with people. He's a much better fit alongside maybe a Jaren Jackson in that you need a five who can space the floor on offense and sort of play that stretch role to let him play the dunker spot. And then on the defensive end, kind of let him play a little bit of off-ball, sort of rotate away, use his strength as an off-ball player. How much of a problem do you think that poses when you look at a guy like Clarke, who is, you elucidated us and how immensely talented he is across the spectrum, but with this weird fit, like how much of a problem do you think something like that is?
I think in general, the way I view players is how are they going to get minutes on like a specific team or on that level, and what's going to limit their minutes. It's all trade-offs. And with Clarke, the trade-offs do severely kind of limit the likely minutes he's going to probably get early on, depending on the fit. Like, once again, if he somehow wound up in Memphis, for instance, he might be able to get more minutes because Jaren Jackson Jr. is a perfect elevate fit next to him. But if he winds up on most teams, it's going to be hard for him to get minutes beyond that backup 5 small ball minutes type role to begin with. And because of that, it then limits kind of the value you can extract from taking him with a high pick. Because if he's not going to be averaging more than like 15 minutes a game, did you really get the most value for your team out of that pick, even though I personally love Brandon Clarke? And I think he's going to be a fun, good NBA player. But the fit is definitely a concern here.
Yeah, and I think the other major concern, and Eustachio, I'm going to throw this one over to you, is, okay, when you look at Brandon Clarke, you're looking at a guy who is 22 years old. He's going to be 22 and a half on draft day. When you compare him to Jackson Hayes is 18.8. When you compare him to Bol, he's a younger guy. He's 19.3, and even Jonte Porter, who is a little bit older because he's a sophomore, only clocks in at 19.3. So you're looking at Brandon Clarke in this role of bigs. How much of a problem is it? By the way, I realized as I was doing that how interesting it is to hear me just list ages as part of radio. So I realized that, audience, as I was doing it, that it wasn't great. But which is to say he's younger. Eustachio, how much do you think that affects his draft stock when he compared to the rest of this class? It's pretty young.
I think it's definitely a factor, and I think it may be a reason why he doesn't go as high as on draft day as we might like him. But at the same time, I think at times some older players tend to get overlooked because if they have an NBA ready skill set in many areas, and Clarke certainly does, he's top 20 in NCAA basketball in both true shooting percentage and block percentage, which is a very rare combination. He's doing it on good volume too. He's not just getting that true shooting percentage on a couple shots a game like some bigs. So he's he has the skills to make an impact in certain areas in the NBA right now. Like Josh said, there are certain areas he needs to develop a little bit and polish, but
What would you say? I'm sorry to cut into you, but like I want to hear what are you kind of in agreement with Josh on what those areas are, or is there something a little bit different you think that he really needs to add to his skill set? Because interestingly, among the three of us, you tend to take a little bit of a different perspective in terms of how guys need to contribute offensively or things of that nature than maybe Josh and I do. Josh and I are a little bit lower on like how important scoring is, possibly too low, and you tend to be a little bit higher on something like that. Is that something that you see as an issue for him?
I think he could really use a corner 3-point shot to his game, not as a feature, but as a counterpunch to his role in the dunker spot where he's going to get lobs and cuts and such. Like Josh said, he's not the best screener on ball, so I don't think you'll use him in the primary actions, but more as the off-ball gravity to try to keep the rim protector away from the primary action. But I think developing that corner 3 will help, but I think he can get on the court right away, though, with his skill set. I see him more as a 5-4, which is a 5 on offense, but a 4 on defense. And I think within that scope where he won't have to bang with Joel Embiid and the bigger post players, he has a route to get on the court right away. I don't know if he'll start immediately, but I think he can become a 20 to 25 minute per game rotation player right off the bat in that type of role, and a little bit of small ball 5 mixed in. But I think the age is causing some people to overlook the upside he has, because he is one of the few guys in this draft that has the potential to be a true high-level impact player on one end of the court. Now, that end is defense when most teams are looking for offense early in the lottery, but he is a tremendous defensive player. Gonzaga is the one team in the country that is both top 10 in offensive field goal percentage and defensive. And a big reason for that margin is that Brandon Clarke is elite at impacting both of those areas. He protects the rim like few players in college basketball, and that's going to translate right away. And
how much do you think, Estacio, how much do you think when you're looking at a guy? I mean, you kind of hit us with the hottest take last week when you were talking about how high you would go on Darius Garland. What is your ceiling for a guy like Clarke? I mean, obviously we know what he does. We know what he brings to the table, but we've talked about some significant downsides. What is your ceiling where you're sitting in the 2 spot, the 3 spot? Obviously not the 1 spot, but where is it that you start to feel comfortable to take a player like Clarke? And I know that kind of puts you on the spot and says like fit isn't dependent, which we all know that fit is super important. But where do you start to feel comfortable with his holes in his game?
I would take him in the 2 to 5 range. I have him in the same range as Darius Garland, DeAndre Hunter, and Grant Williams. I think those 4 players have separated themselves for me at the top of tier 2. Now, I wouldn't take him if the fit is poor, but if I can find a team that fits well in that range, I would take him there. Otherwise, maybe he drops a little bit to find the right fit, but I think he's that level of a prospect.
All right, let's move on to our second guy. And we have to sort of shout out the guys to the step in, or at least for me, I have to shout out to Mike Gribanoff, to Jackson Hoy, to Cole Zwicker, to Spencer Perlman. All these guys, they do tremendous work. If you're not following their work, which I'm sure if you're listening to us, you are, but make sure and check them out. They were some of the first guys that I really saw key in on Jackson Hayes earlier this year. And since then, they have helped, other people see what they saw and sort of bring him along. The perception, I think, has carried a lot by what those guys started on earlier this year. But let's talk about Hayes in a little bit of a pros and cons sort of perspective, because I'm going to start with mine, and I'm going to say my immediate concern with Hayes is here is a player. Okay, you look at his averages, he's 10 points, nothing impressive, super impressive, 5 rebounds. The numbers don't really tell the story when you watch him, so it's easy for him to get swept up. But Hayes is a good shot deterrer. He's a good shot alterer. He has good feet. He knows how to play. He bites on fakes a little too much. But all in all, he's a very good defender. He's for a big man, and immediately looks like, okay, that's a skill set that can get him on the court. But on the flip side of that, I see a player with a very, very limited offensive arsenal. And to me, that's a big concern. Now, we talked about this in pre-show, and we're probably going to talk about it again right now, that there is a place for a big man who not necessarily scores, who maybe is just a roll man or maybe just a vertical threat. Guys like Steven Adams is a good example of this. Clint Capella is a good example of this, that have made their way into the league without being much outside of 8 or 10 feet. Yep. That's a great example. Josh just messaged me DeAndre Jordan, another guy who's been doing this. So obviously there is a market for this guy, but I think, as with most things, it's about finding his good fit. So, Eustaquio, what are your thoughts immediately when it comes to Jaxson Hayes as you watch some tape this week?
Well, I agree with a lot of what you just said, that he's a guy that can really make an impact at the rim, that he has really strong defensive instincts for someone his age. He's one of the youngest prospects in this draft. And so having that level of defensive awareness at this age is very impressive. And he has good length. He's very athletic. And he's very, very limited on the offensive end. It does concern me that he's can basically fill one role on offense. And he, there's no passing feel whatsoever in his game. The assist rate is like tiny. He might get an assist every 2 to 3 weeks. That's about it.
That's a pretty low assist rate.
Yeah. So he's a very one-dimensional guy on offense, but he's pretty good at that one dimension, at least at the college level. He's finishing just under 85% of his shots at the rim, which is a fantastic number. It's not high volume, but it's still efficient offense. And I do have some concerns, though, with his frame. He's 6'11", 220. He's not the strongest guy in the world yet. Will that translate at the next level? Will he be able to finish through contact against the fives in the NBA? Because he has to be a 5. He has no skills that correspond with the 4, so he has to be strictly a 5 on both ends of the court. That does concern me. The other concern I have is his rebounding, which he's better on the offensive end of the court, where he can attack the ball and use his athleticism to grab it at its peak, out jump everybody around him. But he doesn't have the strength to box out on the defensive end and to help his team to rebound the ball well. He may have decent individual rebounding numbers, but Texas right now is number 257 in the country in offensive rebound percentage allowed. So that's a concern at the NBA level as well.
I think just to touch on one point before I sort of redirect this to Josh, I think a little bit of it has to do with the players around him. And I don't mean to say that it belies, that he's not a great rebounder. I do think that there are legitimate rebounding concerns, but Osikowski grabs a lot of boards. Kerwin Roach, when he was playing, is a pretty good rebounder for a guard. So I think there are a little bit, like, the actual raw numbers are a little bit deceptive. Now, that is not to take away from the issue, because I don't think he's quite explosive enough to be a true apogee rebounder. Obviously, you touched on him not having the body to be a box out rebounder or a position rebounder. So I do think there are some concerns, but I did want to just say, hey, wait a second. There's a little bit of something here where some other guys are grabbing a lot of boards on the team. But Josh, what do you see when you look at a guy like Jaxson Hayes with the skill set that he has, similar to Clark, in that he sort of fills this role of, okay, he's pretty one-dimensional on offense. I think he's much more limited than Clark comparatively, but he sort of just fills this one role. But then when you flip over, you see a guy who brings a lot to a team defense. And I know that's a really big deal to you. How much does the downside on the offensive end factor in as you sort of weigh? You look at this guy and you go, hey, we got some talent here, but man, he is a net zero or net negative on the offensive end. How much, when you like a player, like a Jackson Hayes. Does that factor in for you?
Yeah, like I mentioned before, for me it's all trade-offs. What does playing this player mean to the other parts of your lineup? What do you have to put in place with this guy on the court to cover up for the negative trade-offs or to maybe enhance the positive ones? I don't think he would be a net negative on offense because he does have a lot of finishing kind of gravity. Like if he's in the dunker spot, teams are going to have to, factor that in their defensive coverages. They're going to have to account for him. My one main concern with him, Eustachio touched on his frame and everything, and I think it can actually be even more limiting on the offensive end when you factor in that while he's a willing screener, he doesn't really consistently give his teammate an edge with his screens, and because of that can limit how much he's utilized in a role, in the pick and roll as the roll man type role, which could then therefore just limit him to mostly being a rim runner in transition and the dunker spot in the half court, which is very likely to severely limit his minutes on an NBA team that's trying to compete. So I think him gaining strength is going to be important for him getting bigger minutes, not just in terms of, helping with the rebounding issue and kind of making him even tougher on defense, but also I think if he can get more strength, he can kind of tighten up those screens that he sets. That's going to allow him to, get into that pick and roll man option a little bit more frequently, which should open up more minutes for him.
Yeah, Josh, you touched on something about strength there, and I think there's a question about Jackson Hayes, and I'm not sure if he's a freshman or if he doesn't have this reputation as a fierce rim runner. But Eustachio, you touched on some stats earlier when we were talking about it, and I'd love for you to bring them out here because you have some really interesting numbers that sort of give us a point on Hayes.
So something I was looking at earlier today were some on-off stats that Will Sharifer posted on Twitter. He's great. Give him a follow. He has some unique stats for college basketball. But for Jackson Hayes in particular, when he's on the court, how the defense does against when he's off, and specifically at the rim. He lowers opponent efficiency at the rim by about 9% when he's on the court. But one thing he doesn't do as a rim protector is lower the opponent's volume at the rim. 57% at the rim is still a solid shot in the framework of a half-court offense. And so you want to dissuade those shots from even happening. The best rim protectors are good positional defenders that both lower attempts at the rim and efficiency. And so I'm not sure that Jackson Hayes, at least to date, has displayed that. That's something he will need to work on as time goes on, is becoming not just an impact defender, but a good positional defender. And he may develop that. He's shown some good instincts overall at this age, but to date, that hasn't been demonstrated. And so we have to factor that in when we're talking about his defensive ceiling.
All right, so let's move on and talk about another one of our big men. Let's talk about Bol Bol. Obviously, he has that pedigree of an NBA player. His father, Manute, played for many years. But we didn't get to see enough of Bol Bol. He had a foot injury that sort of took him out. He only got to play 9 games in college basketball this year, which is a small sample size, but we've done more with less when we looked at Darius Garland last week. So let's kind of get into Bol Bol. And Eustachio, I'm going to throw it to you to let you kind of give us the synopsis, because you're a little bit higher on what he brings to the table than I am, and I'm not sure quite where Josh falls into that spectrum. But let's hear your take to start off with.
Now, I still think there's certain flaws in Bol's game, but what I like about him is that he's so unique and he brings an upside that very few players ever have. He's a 7'2" player that has a buttery smooth jump shot. He can draw the opposing rim protector out to the perimeter, which helps open up a lot on offense. And on top of that, he is, like you said, the son of one of the best shot blockers ever to play in the NBA. He's not quite as tall as his father, but he still likewise is likely to make a big shot blocking impact. And that those two things in combination can have very high team level impact. And so I think that combination, and I mean, he's not just a one-dimensional offensive player. He has a little bit of a post game. He can handle the ball a little, attack closeouts. He's a better passer than advertised. And so I think there's quite a bit of offensive upside and enough on the defensive end that he can become a very unique player in the NBA level, a player that can give his team tactical advantages. There are certain flaws in him. His frame is not strong at all, and his rebounding will likely suffer because of that. His post defense, he's going to get pushed around. His intelligence on the court needs work, but there's also just heights in his game that other players simply cannot reach.
Yeah, you touched on something on the flip side about his physicality, and he's had the foot injury, which is a concern for a guy at 7'2". Anytime you have a 7-footer with a lower body injury, that tends to sort of stick in your mind. But I think there are some other physical things about him. He's not a great screener. He's just not strong. He doesn't impose his will physically on the game. Josh, how much when you look at a guy Bol Bol's size, do you think it factors in? I mean, you can certainly touch on the foot injury if you want to, but all these other things that he just sort of lacks when you look at his game.
Yeah, as somebody who grew up in Oregon, I am particularly wary of 7-footers who have lower limb injuries.
Yeah.
It's definitely a little more stressful to me as an Oregonian than it is to maybe some other areas of the country. But to me, and I've mentioned this to you guys before in a previous discussion about Bol Bol, like off the recording, how his skill set, and I know it's most useful from a big standpoint because he would draw the rim protector out, but his skill set more reminds me of a wing than it does a big per se. And so I wouldn't be surprised to see some teams kind of utilize him a little bit more in that regard, not necessarily coming off screens like a Markkanen or a Porzingis, because we haven't really seen him do any of that on the college level yet, and we won't. To me, he's very interesting. I'm with you, Stockio, in the sense that I think he's very unique. And I think he does have avenues for a team-wide impact. I think the potential issue is that frame makes it really hard for him to kind of be an effective screener, which is also going to limit some of his pick and pop opportunities or his roll opportunities, because the best way to get free for those is actually to set a good screen in the first place. And I think Eustachio touched on it a little bit. He's going to get pushed around in the post on defense. I think he's also going to be kind of targeted on the perimeter too. If he winds up on a team which has a more aggressive pick and roll coverage scheme, or which employs a lot of switching, Bol Bol is going to absolutely be hunted by opposing teams defensively. That said, I do think Eustachio touched on this with Jackson Hayes, the kind of difference between a rim protector and a rim deterrent. And I think Bol Bol, when you factor in his unique physical traits, the fact that his father is kind of a very well-known, at least in the basketball world, shot blocker and stuff, I think he'll have some rim deterrence already. The second he gets on an NBA court, I think teams are going to be a little hesitant to come straight at him if he's near the rim. So I think Eustachio is correct in that there's avenues for team-wide impact that could be really beneficial, but I'm not quite where Eustachio is in terms of how much I value that in relation to where Bol Bol's likely going to get drafted and the other trade-offs that he's going to provide to team lineup construction.
I mean, I guess because his dad, talking about his dad, the pedigree and all that, that's important because you have that name recognition. It means something. Now, it gets you in the door. It doesn't. He's going to have to play his way on the court, but I think he's certainly. I think that's a pretty good way to open up the door. And but the question I think is he actually a rim deterrent? Is he actually a shot blocker? And Eustaquio, you have those numbers. Give us a little bit of context on what you've seen with Bol Bol from Will's numbers.
So something that was very noticeable with Bol Bol is that when he was on the court, opponents shot at the rim a lot less. And we've had a big sample with Bol off the court now, and opponents are taking about 22 attempts per 75 possessions at the rim. Now, when he's on the court, that lowers to 18 attempts per 75 possessions. And because of his length, he's impacting not just shots at the rim, but shots in the mid-range. He showed a proficiency for blocking jump shots, not just attempts around the rim. So he's deterring not just attempts at the rim, but attempts in the mid-range, forcing teams to take lower quality three-point shots when he's on the court. Now, part of that is because teams just see the 7-2 guy, think, I should not go into the paint. He's not the best technical rim protector. And so I think NBA teams may target him a little bit more so, go after him and challenge him in the paint. But I think that effect will still be maintained to some degree. He's still a 7-2 guy with these huge arms. People aren't going to drive at him if they can avoid it. So I think that's something that is important to factor in on the NBA level.
Well, let's move on and talk about our last guy, and then let's do a little team fit. Let's talk about Jontay Porter. He's the man of mystery. We saw him last year sort of living in his brother's shadow, even though his brother wasn't playing. Michael Porter's shadow hung large over Missouri's entire season, and maybe we didn't recognize Jontay for what he was as a contributor. And then he decided he would go back to Missouri, and just like that, he was snatched away from us as basketball fans. So we're left with a little bit of a mystery as to what Jontay Porter is. Now, I said that Eustaquio was a big Bol Bol guy. We probably have also the biggest Jontay Porter guy on the internet. So I'm going to come to you, Josh, and let you do the breakdown. But I just want to look at these numbers really quickly. 9.9 points per game, 6.8 rebounds, 2.2 assists, shot 36% from three on 3 attempts. So there is a wide skill set there, but not necessarily something we've gotten to see too much of during his short stint at Missouri, where he only played about 20 minutes a game for the season. But Josh, what do you see in Jontay that excites you so much?
Yeah, I've written about my elevate approach before, and we've discussed it on a previous pod. And Jontay, to me, is such an elevate player for an NBA team. He's not necessarily spectacular as an individual, but in terms of his team context, when you plug him into a lineup, he's got outstanding court awareness. He both in terms of his passing and his own movement to make sure that there's always consistent spacing, to always, kind of help whomever it currently has the ball have a slightly easier time when it comes to finding driving lanes or passing angles and that sort of thing. He's the type of guy where casual fans, if you're watching, you might not necessarily pick up all the little things that he's doing that's helping his team, but coaches and scouts are definitely noticing all these little things that he's doing where he's setting up his teammates for success. And I really think defensively that's the case as well. He's one of the most consistent communicators on defense that I've seen in this class, which is something that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. Defense is a team thing, and having good, consistent communicators in your lineup helps kind of strengthen the team defense. And I think right away, considering how much he communicated as a pretty young freshman in the 1 year that we do have of college tape of him, shows he's likely going to do this on the NBA level as well. And while the main knocks on him are significant, he doesn't have a whole lot of high level speed. He's not overly lateral agility advanced in terms of NBA relative ability there. He's not freakishly big or freakishly strong, like he's not playing for Tennessee. So, there are things there where, like, you look at it and you're like, that's going to soften things a little bit. But his high IQ, understanding of the game, his awareness, his anticipation allows him to put himself in position to kind of snuff out some of these driving lanes, these passing angles that he helps open up on offense. He helps snuff them out on defense just through his positioning, just making those a little more difficult, kind of a la Marc Gasol, that type where, the athleticism isn't standing out to you, but he's doing the little things that really help. And I think the athleticism stuff is going to be potentially a drawback, at least in terms of him getting minutes fairly early on, depending on what team he winds up with. Same thing with Bol, like if he's put in a team that's very switch happy, or they have a very aggressive pick and roll coverage style, it's probably not going to make Jonte look that good. If it's more of a conservative drop or down style pick and roll coverage, I think Jonte is going to flourish in that. I also think his rebounding numbers are probably going to be disappointing to most people on the NBA level, but he consistently boxes out, so I think he's going to have a Brook and Robin Lopez type impact on the overall team rebounding, where he's constantly boxing his man out or boxing out other man for his teammates to collect the rebound and stuff. So I think he's one of those guys that he's going to contribute a lot to the team, but it's not always going to look super pretty in the box score for him. Like, people aren't going to be like, holy crud, Jonte is racking up the stats, but his team is going to be better when he's on the court. And that's why I like him.
I think the concern about athleticism is pretty founded. I like Jonte a lot, but I think the concern about his athleticism is pretty founded because essentially what athleticism does is it increases your margin for error. Now, Jonte Porter is obviously one of the smartest players in this draft, very high IQ, a player who applies his intelligence all over the court. So that gives him a little margin for error. But on the flip side, he lacks a lot of explosiveness. He doesn't have that tremendous pop. He doesn't even really have that league average pop. He's pretty well below the average when it comes to his leaping ability, his explosiveness, his quickness, his agility, those kinds of things. Eustaquio, when you look at a player with this kind of dichotomy as a high IQ guy, but lacking the physical tools, both of these things are obviously important, but how much does that trade-off affect the way you look at a player like Jonte Porter?
I think it's a question of which one matters most with the player in question. And it's not always the same answer. For some players, the tools matter more, but others, the intelligence makes up for it. And I think with Jonte, I think it's the latter case where his intelligence enables him to overcome the physical limitations. He played at Missouri last year in a conservative defensive scheme. The team as a whole only averaged 7.5% steal rate. Jonte himself led the team with a 2% steal rate. And that's as the big man, as not the quickest guy around, but his anticipation enabled him to get that production despite of the physical limitations. And I think that's evident throughout his game, that he uses his intelligence to make up for the limitations that he has. And so I think he does need to make some improvements as far as getting into better condition to be able to play bigger minutes. He only played like mid 20 minutes at Missouri. He needs to be able to run up and down the floor in the NBA. He played at a slow pace at Missouri as well. So there's some work to be done there. But I think as far as effectiveness when he is on the court, I'm not overly concerned because he's just a step ahead of most players, and that can make him look quicker than he is and functionally be quicker. So, yeah, would bet on the intelligence being what matters most.
And we talked about this earlier in the year, sort of after this happened. We had a great lament where we talked about Jonte Porter's ACL and how much it might affect him. But uh, as you both touched on, this is a player who relies predominantly on his ability to think the game very well, which is something he does, and something that I think the three of us, as well as the brand, as Red Team Scouting, we really value those kinds of players because they tend to be a little bit more adaptable. You can have a guy, he can play in this system or he can play in this system, and maybe it's not the best fit for him, but that adaptability is certainly a nice draw to have in a player. But before we wrap this whole thing up, we've talked about all four of these guys. I want to go through with each of you and talk about what you think their fit is when you look at one of these guys. Fit has been so important to us, elevating the team concept, elevating, putting a player in a position to succeed. These things are so important to us as a brand, to us as individuals as we look at it. So I want to talk about these four. Last week we went with Hunter, we went through the guards and we sort of put them on teams. This week we're going to take a little bit of a different approach, and I want to talk about the players and see where you think they fit. And so we'll just kind of go back and forth on this one, but give me what you think your thoughts are on their fit, and then maybe where you kind of see them fitting into a nice niche with a team if you've got one of those on hand. So, Josh, let's start with you. Let's talk about Brandon Clarke. What do you see Brandon Clarke's fit issues? We talked a little bit about that 4-5 situation. Where do you see him fitting in well?
I think he's going to fit in best with a team that has a big who's a spacing threat on offense so that the paint's not going to be crowded. He's going to be able to, operate within that dunker spot with some effectiveness. And I personally, I think, and part of this is just me being selfish because I live in Colorado. I think he'd be fantastic with Denver, for instance. They don't even have a first-round pick, so it's not going to happen. But I think he would be great in Denver because you combine strong help defense, strong finishing ability, and cutting, and that's a recipe for a good fit next to Jokic in their system. I mean, we've seen that with Fareed and Plumlee. And I think Clarke would help a lot defensively, and he'd still be able to get his own looks and stuff out of cuts and, working from that dunker spot and being a rim runner without necessarily having to improve the threat of his shot, which I think is going to be something that's going to be key for him to get minutes on most NBA teams, is he's going to have to prove that his jumper is at least NBA average for teams to actually care much about him being on the court if he's not right near dunking range. So I think a role with a team like Denver would really help. I also think he would be great with Memphis. We touched on it earlier. I think Jaren Jackson Jr. is the ideal elevate fit next to him, a big who can space on offense, not going to clog a bunch of stuff up at the rim, and who's kind of more of the last line guy, which allows Clarke to kind of operate in that free safety area. Plus, to me, out of lottery teams, if he gets taken in the lottery, I hope he winds up with Memphis, simply for the fact, if you're a Memphis fan and you buy into blue-collar grit and grind, how fun of a young core is Jaren Jackson Jr., Javon Carter, and Brandon Clarke. That's going to be such a fun, just grimy defensive core to have, and I think they would complement each other very well, and I'd love to see that.
Also complement the city very well.
Yes.
The city that sort of clamors for those kinds of things. Estacio, what about you? When you look at Brandon Clarke, where do you see the fit situation from the general to the specific?
So I agree with a lot of what Josh said there. I would say that Brandon Clarke is a 5'4" that needs to play next to a 4'5". And what I mean by that is that he needs to play the dunker role on offense, but defend fours on defense. And so he needs to be with someone who can stretch the floor a little bit, but also be the primary post defender, be the primary rebounder on defense. So I think the fit in Memphis is good, but what I would be concerned about there is defensive rebounding because neither Jaren Jackson nor Brandon Clark are great at that. So a fit that I like a little bit better than that is in Minnesota with Karl Anthony Towns, who can provide the offensive diversity to open the game up for Clark on one end, but also provide the rebounding and the size on the defensive end to free Clark up to be that sort of free safety to impact the game in a variety of ways.
Interesting. Those are both really good, and that sort of takes my thoughts in there. So I'll leave that one there, and we'll move on to Jackson Hayes. Eustaquio, what are your thoughts on Jackson Hayes? We talked about his limitations and his skills. What do you see him fitting? Generally, where do you see him fitting in from a basketball philosophical point of view, and then sort of specifically, where do you see him fit in?
Well, Hayes is a true five on both ends of the court, and that being the case, he needs space to operate on offense, but also because of his frame, he's not really going to be the best defensive rebounder. So he needs some help on that end of the court with cleaning the glass on a team level. As far as a specific location, I think an early career fit that would be great for him would actually be in Cleveland next to Kevin Love, who provides the offensive spacing he needs, but also is a fantastic defensive rebounder that will help ease the burden on him on that end of the court.
All right, Josh, what about you?
I actually really like that Cleveland choice, assuming they keep Caleb. To me, we talked a little bit. We mentioned Capella earlier in regards to him. To me, Hayes is going to be best served where he can essentially be that Capella role. He's the vertical threat, the vertical gravity lob threat guy. Obviously, Houston wouldn't work because he's probably going to be picked way before them. But that kind of Clint Capella-esque role, especially if he can improve his strength, which he should be able to do on the NBA level with strength and conditioning that's available at that level of competition, that should help him once again improve his screening, which gets him more minutes as the roll man. So I could see him thriving in that type of role. Not necessarily a great fit for him specifically, but a team in the lottery that I think would work well for Hayes, at least in the first few seasons of him, is actually the Wizards. Porter's gone. Bradley Beal's probably going to be traded maybe this next offseason, and John Wall's contract and injury basically makes him unmovable. So John Wall is basically the guy going forward once he's healthy again. And because of Otto being gone now and playing fantastic with the Bulls, by the way, and Bradley Beal potentially being moved too, if you're Washington, that fan base, it's probably hard to feel much hope for the next couple of years. Jackson Hayes is the type of young, exciting prospect that if that team were to draft him, I can see the fan base at least having some glimmer of hope. You know, he's exciting with his lob dunks and his shot blocking. He basically is the equation for potential ceiling for most people. So I think that could introduce some hope for those poor fans. And I think once Wall comes back, that vertical gravity that Hayes would have would actually benefit Wall too. So I think that would be a nice spot for him, even if not necessarily the ideal fit for him.
I kind of have one in that similar vein. That's not the ideal fit for him, but could be really interesting just as a pairing. Atlanta has some interesting questions when it comes to fitting someone alongside John Collins, and we have spoken off air about how John Collins sort of fits into their future plans. And so I don't really want to dig into that too deeply, but you look at a guy like Jackson Hayes, who is a lob threat. He's 94th percentile as a pick and roll man. Obviously he needs to learn how to make a little bit more contact when he does these things. But when you have a passer like Trae Young, a guy who creates so much horizontal gravity when he's on the floor, and a player who's tremendous pinpoint passer, giving him a lob threat like Jackson Hayes, while it may not be a seamless fit alongside John Collins, giving him a lob threat, a guy who can really space the floor vertically, and then a guy who can kind of pick up the pieces behind them on a defensive way. I think he could be an interesting fit there. I know that there are some other fits that Atlanta fans in particular maybe want a little more, but I wouldn't hate to see that long term. I think there could be something interesting there. So let's move on and talk about guy number 3, and that is Bol Bol. Estacio Bol. I don't mean to make it sound like you're carrying the banner for him, but I guess amongst this group, you're kind of carrying the banner for him. So where is your fit? Where do you see him sort of fitting in?
So I think he's kind of the reverse of Brandon Clark in a way. He's a 4-5 that needs to go next to a 5-4. So he's going to be that stretch big on offense. But on defense, you want his length, his rim protection to be dissuading shots at the rim. What he needs next to him then is a guy that has that vertical gravity to take advantage of his spacing, a rim runner, someone who can get a lot of dunks based on that gravity. And but someone that's still mobile enough to defend the 4 spot on defense and also help out on the boards. It's a little bit of a tricky fit to find someone that checks all those boxes, but I actually like him in the spot where you put Jackson Hayes in Atlanta next to John Collins, because Collins is such a good rebounder, such a good vertical threat, and he can work at the 4 spot on defense. Ideally you want him to play some 5, but he can function as the 4 at times.
All right, Josh, what about you, man?
It wouldn't happen in terms of actually being selected by them, but I think perhaps the ideal kind of role for him would be Brook Lopez's role with the Milwaukee Bucks right now. Their defense is one of the more conservative ones in terms of their pick and roll coverages. They're more focused at dissuading shots and contesting shots at the rim. So they usually have their bigs like Brook drop or down in pick and roll coverage, which would play perfectly well into Bol Bol's strengths in that rim deterrence, that length, that shot blocking threat, while also minimizing how much he'd have to be out on the perimeter, which therefore kind of reduces some of the concerns there. And then offensively, his role would be to space, which is exactly what Bol Bol's best at. So, to me, if he can wind up in a team that runs systems kind of like Milwaukee, I think he'd be in line for a decent amount of minutes pretty early on.
Yeah, the interesting fit, and this team is pretty terrible, but the interesting fit, I think Phoenix sort of provides that a little bit of that for him, where they got some nice young guys. They got Booker, they got Ayton. Ayton kind of absorbs a little bit more of the punishment as that 5. He's a bigger guy, 260. And then you get to have Bol, play a little bit off the ball, a little bit more. A little bit more of that 4-man role where he doesn't have to be as concerned about a rebounder. And then he opens up a little bit more space while still providing some defensive deterrent. And I think, when you look at Phoenix, if they end up at 1 or 2, it's a little bit harder to sort of rationalize Bol being there, though maybe not if you really think he is the elevate fit, which is certainly possible. But if they end up more in the 4, 5, 6, 7 range, I certainly think that is a player who's in play for them because he really just fits with the talent they have there. Now, I think sort of on the converse of that, I think there are a lot of lingering questions about who Phoenix is that Phoenix has to figure out. So we may be looking at a roster that is entirely made up in a different way next year versus, the success that they've seen or lack thereof that they've seen this year. So, but I think Phoenix is an interesting, as they are presently constructed, I think Phoenix is an interesting fit for Bol. So let's talk about our last guy. And then we'll let you faithful listeners go because we appreciate you taking your time to listen. Let's talk about Jontay Porter. Josh, I'm just going to start with you on this one because, the banner carrier for the Jontay Porter committee.
Mm-hmm. Proudly. Yeah. To me, Jontay's the type that he's going to fit, at least offensively, on the vast majority of NBA teams. He sets good screens that give his ball handlers an advantage on their defenders. He's a strong pick and pop threat who's probably going to get the benefit of the doubt from NBA defenses fairly early on. On top of that, he can attack closeouts at least somewhat and make plays out of it. And he keeps the ball moving. So I think he can function offensively on most teams. Defensively is where, once again, it's kind of going to depend somewhat on scheme. Much like with the Bull thing, I think a more conservative system in terms of their pick and roll coverage, where the big drops or downs, depending on the terminology you want to use, I think that would benefit him and would allow him to get solid minutes. The team in the lotto that I think would actually really be kind of nice for him is actually Charlotte, because Kimba. Bless Kimba. You gotta love Kimba if you're a Charlotte Hornets fan. But Kimba doesn't really have a whole lot of help. And he's got some guys who set good picks and stuff, but he doesn't really have a pop threat. And especially if you're trying to play Michael Kidd-Gilchrist a decent amount of minutes with his lack of spacing, having a big who's a pick and pop threat like Jonte to put in that lineup with Michael Kidd-Gilchrist is going to help maximize Kidd-Gilchrist's minutes as well. On top of it, I think the pop threat will help open up more driving space for Kimba coming off of pick and rolls and dribble handoffs and that sort of thing. In essence, I think Jonte can be what Charlotte thought Frank Kaminsky would be for them, but actually good defensively too.
All right. It was kind of damning with faint praise, but and I know you're higher on him than Frank Kaminsky, but Estaquio, what about you?
I think I see Jonte Porter probably playing more of the 4 than the 5 on defense just because of his lack of length. I think he's a good fit in most scenarios on offense. You don't really have to worry about that. His passing, his shooting, it makes him work with just about anyone. The defense is the trickier question, whether you use him as that small 5 or try to make him work at the 4 spot. He's a very good positional defender, but he's doesn't have the standing reach to really block a lot of shots at the NBA level. So one spot that I like for him specifically is the Brooklyn Nets alongside Jarrett Allen, who can be that shot blocker next to him, the rim runner that can take advantage of his perimeter gravity. And the Nets are a very modern team, so they'll station him beyond the three-point arc and make the most of that shooting and passing skill that he has. So that's a fit that I like. I can understand using him more as a small ball 5 off the bench, but I think long term, if he's going to be a starter, it's going to be at the 4 spot.
This may be a little bit of wishful thinking. I try not to let my fandom shine through, particularly as we go, as we evaluate and that kind of thing. But maybe a little bit of a wishful thinking. But it looks like the Sacramento pick is going to convey to the Boston Celtics. And you hear a lot of the Al Horford comparison, which I'm not huge on player comparisons, but there are certainly some parallels between these two players. And I think that the Boston Celtics would be a tremendous fit for Jonte Porter for a lot of the reasons that Josh said. It's a team that likes to play drop coverage a lot, not overly aggressive. They sort of hedge and recover. They don't blitz over the top of picks. They let their big men kind of deter shots and do the work. And I would love for Jonte Porter, for him, for the league, for basketball, and then, of course, just a teeny little bit for the Celtics as well, to get to learn from Al Horford and get to play, with the Celtics tend to protect Horford with Aaron Baines a little bit. And so let him kind of play that 4 and that 5 role, which is something, Estaquio, that you touched on, is like what you do with him. So I think that is a really interesting fit. I think there is a possibility he falls that far because of the injury concern. Now, if the three of us were locked in a room and we were picking for every NBA team, that would not happen. However, with 30 teams, there are 30 distinctly different boards, and it only takes a few teams for a guy to slide down that far. So, and I don't even feel that bad because Eustaquio had the Nets, and they're like the 6th seed in the East. So at least I'm talking lottery here. But that would be a team that I think fitting in Brad Stevens' system and sort of that Celtics like to emphasize that high IQ kind of defender. Although this season it's been a little bit different, and that's a whole other story and a whole other sad part of my life that I don't want to talk about. But when it comes to fit and elevate and all of the concepts that we like to talk about, I think the Boston Celtics would be a good place for Jontay Porter to land. So, well, that wraps it up. Those are the big men for you. Please let us know what you think on Twitter. Let us know. Hit us up. Communicate with us. We love talking. We love hearing your feedback on everything. Josh, what are you working on this week? I know you're working intently on shooting form. Are you working on anything else?
Yeah, so I'm looking to scout a couple of players for our next rounds of reports and stuff. I'm also working on improving the contextual scouting course. The next one is going to tip off April 29th, and I'm always working on making it better and better, and already updated a lot of stuff, and so look for more stuff in a couple of weeks on that. And I'm starting work on some research for some blog posts and stuff, so should be some interesting stuff coming down the line in a couple of weeks, hopefully.
Excellent. You can follow Josh on Twitter at 2redjearl. You can follow him at Contextual Scouting as well. Make sure to check out his course. It is tremendous. Being able to communicate with people, like-minded people, just being able to talk sometimes helps you open up the way you think. And so highly, highly recommend that. Make sure to follow Josh and check out Contextual Scouting as well. Eustaquio, you're always working about 24/7 on this guide. What do you have this coming week for us?
Right now, we're releasing the Grant Williams profile on Friday, and so I'm working on the write-up for that. He's a player I'm very excited about. I put him at number 3 on my big board today. That's my personal big board, not the site rankings, but it's a player that really fits a lot of what we talk a lot about on this podcast and on our website, that he's a guy that helps elevate his team. And so look for that coming up on Friday. And yeah, I'm working on about a million other things too, but we won't get into that.
You can follow Eustaquio at EVRR10 or EVR1022 on Twitter. You can also follow him in a low usage role at Red Team Scouting, even though Steve Kuhn does most of our work on the Twitter box. But Eustaquio is always working. The small improvements that you don't even notice until they have snuck up on you, those are all him. So let him know, give him your positive thoughts and your feedback on all the site design and all that, because he does a tremendous job with all that. My docket this week finished up on Trey Jones, on Jackson Hayes, on Grant Williams. I have Matisse Thybulle coming up. I also have Rui Hachimura and Nikhil Alexander-Walker. So those are the guys that I'm watching this week. I have been in the film pretty hardcore for these past couple of weeks, which has been really nice because it's sort of let me immerse myself in this class and get a feel for it. And it's something I like to do. You can follow me on Twitter at AlexWestNBA. I'm more than happy. I put out the weirdest big board you've ever seen today. If you want to check that out, it's not numbers. It's like, I don't know. It's like one of those schools where they don't do testing or whatever, where they just kind of like, you just kind of put guys where you feel. And that's what I did with my big board. So I took a different approach because I didn't want to give you Eustaquio's board writ small. So anyway, check that out. Make sure to follow the site, redteamscouting.com. Follow us on Twitter at redteamscouting. Give us all your feedback and all your positive energy and all your negative energy. We'll take it all, as long as we're just getting the content that you guys want to see. We love to hear from all of you. So for the Red Team Draft Podcast, I'm your host, Alex West, speaking for Josh Earl, for Eustaquio Raleigh, and then for the absent Connor Haar, who you can follow at Haar Connor on Twitter. Make sure, particularly if you're into the Ohio high school sports scene, he's got your hookup if you're looking for Ohio high school basketball scores. But Connor, we miss you, buddy, and we will see you next week. For the Red Team Scouting Podcast, I'm your host, Alex West. See you next week.